It has been a little while since we last all got together, so a little rusty in Zoom, but I think we'll make it work. Okay, so I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, just in case. I know you guys are busy and going through your tax rate adoption, budget adoption, and so if there's specific questions you guys have, I wanted to leave some time at the end of the presentation for that. And so I'm just going to quickly go over some TEA updates that have sort of come down in the past couple of days. I'm going to start actually with some public health issues. This announcement was made by TEA yesterday. I think a lot of districts are asking them about sort of how to reconcile the governor's orders and sort of what is TEA's guidance during this time whenever there's some conflict between that and what some local officials and counties are doing. And so TEA's answer here is pretty much they're staying out of it. They're going to let this play out in the courts. And so we'll just have to know that TEA is not going to be a source of guidance on how to sort of implement public health best practices during this time where we have the governor's order and then local officials sort of acting in what they feel is the best interest of students in their communities. And so just know that this is certainly going to the courts. It's I think the latest was the governor and the attorney general have filed an appeal. And so we'll have to wait and see how all that plays out. So just wanted to at least let y'all make sure y'all are aware of this most recent announcement from TEA. So that's kind of what TEA isn't doing. TEA is doing some things to help districts during this sort of back to school period. They are putting together a rapid test program. Again, this is opt-in. It's certainly not required, but if you're looking, if your district is interested in quickly offering rapid tests to teachers and students, this is a resource, so it can help you guys save some costs. That way you guys don't have to go out and procure these yourself. And so you can fill out this application and opt in to receiving rapid tests. You see the deadline there in red. The application will close Thursday, August 19th. I think on a separate website, it said the 29th, but on the commissioner call yesterday, Morath referenced the 19th. And so I think that's the correct deadline. I know there was some confusion there. So regardless, just make sure you guys are moving quickly if you do want to get those resources and save your district a little bit of money. That way you guys don't have to go out and get it on your own. There are some requirements that I have listed here on the right-hand side. There's others in the application as you move through that, but just know that there's within this program, there's not funding for folks to administer the test. You got to find a place to store them, so they can't be stored in sort of an air-conditioned facility. And then you can only use the test for employees and students. You can't use it just for the general public. And there's some other ones, but those are sort of the main requirements for the program. Also with virtual education, as y'all know, that did not pass during the A7th regular session. And so what TEA has tried to do through some proposed amendments to the student attendance accounting handbook is funding of remote conferencing. And this previously was used primarily for special education students, but they're putting together some new rules and some amendments to the SAW to sort of create this mechanism for regular education students. And there's some requirements there. And again, this is to get funding for remote attendance. Districts are certainly able to offer, and some districts are choosing to offer remote education and just not get funding for that from the state, essentially. But if you are trying to draw down some funding for that, these are the guidelines that TEA has put together so far. So the first sort of batch of rules has to do with what students are eligible. A student has to be unable to attend school because of a temporary medical condition documented by a physician. And that's sort of the traditional how remote conferencing worked. But TEA has also added the student can also be unable to attend school because they're excluded from on-campus attendance. And they can be excluded for sort of two main reasons. Either they list positive, or they have a positive test result for a communicable disease, and COVID-19 has been added to that list. That's regulations sort of maintained by the state health department, or the student is suspected of having a communicable disease. And so that language was kind of surprising because that leaves a lot of discretion up to the schools, and that has not been the overall policy sort of mode from the governor or TEA. They seem to be very prescriptive lately, and so that's the way TEA is sort of running this now. They are allowing districts to, again, exclude students from on-campus attendance if they have a positive test result or they're suspected of having a communicable disease. And then once that student is excluded from on-campus attendance, you can offer this remote conferencing option and get funded for that. The remote conferencing cannot exceed more than 20 instructional days over the entire school year. And so even if you do 10 days at one point a year and then 10 days on another, that's it for the whole school year. It's it doesn't matter if they're consecutive or not. If you want to exceed 20 instructional days for remote conferencing, you have to get a waiver from TEA. And I think we're going to get some more details on that in the coming weeks from the agency. But right now, the sort of cap without a waiver is 20 days. To get funded under this, there's also certain sort of hour instructional requirements, and that varies by grade level. So for pre-K through 5th grade, you have to receive 4 hours of instruction. That's sort of full-time funding. And 2 of those hours must be synchronous. They don't need to be consecutive hours, right? So you can do an hour synchronous in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, and that would meet that requirement. 6th grade through 12th grade, they all 4 hours have to be synchronous, but still they don't have to be consecutive, but all 4 hours of instruction have to be synchronous instruction. And so those are the requirements to get funding for this remote conferencing option that TEA has put together for the coming school year. There's
Charles,
also, yes.
Well, you know what? Let me let you keep going on.
Oh, okay.
Before I have a question. Thanks.
Okay. There's a bill that has been approved by the Senate. As y'all may be aware, there's the original bill, House Bill 1468, did not pass in the 87th regular session. Then we had a first called special session where there were no bills really considered for the related to virtual education. Now with the second called special session that I believe started August 7th, somewhere around there, virtual education was added to the call. And so the Senate quickly took up Senate Bill 15, which is very similar to House Bill 1468. There's some differences, they're pretty minor though. But the Senate Ed Committee quickly took that up and passed it, and then the full Senate passed it just a few days ago. And so that bill, again, similar to 1468, creates a local remote learning program. Districts have to meet certain performance requirements to be able to offer that. I think it's a C or better on their performance rating. and it's limited to 10% of total enrolled students. Again, so much with this session is up in the air. We don't know exactly if anything will get done. If the House doesn't have a quorum, certainly nothing is going to become law. And so there's a whole lot of questions on just what is able to be accomplished this session. But related to this bill in particular, there's a lot of concern over where to set that threshold, that 10% threshold. I know a lot of senators are sort of worried about that as being too high. And so it wouldn't surprise me if that percentage threshold changed in the final version of the bill. And so, Connie, if you had questions about virtual education, I can go ahead and take those now.
If you could go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the student attendance accounting handbook, the remote conferencing has been there for regular ed all the time, right? I mean, district, or was it specifically?
Right. I mean,
because that was kind of news for folks.
It was for regular ed. I think it was still. I mean, you still had to have a temporary medical condition documented by a physician. So I think that part was there. I think it was primarily used for special education students. That I think both were on the books, but the primary use of it was to serve special education students.
Districts weren't as set up, obviously, for remote learning as they are now, because I remember the commissioner when he first brought that up, I guess 2 weeks ago, and it said, for common cold, and it said, and I thought, oh my gosh, districts now hopefully can tap into it for more reasons than COVID. Because it just seems like if a child can get remote instruction for up to 20 days a year, and I'm assuming that waiver, Josh, is just a waiver for the district one time, or is it,
that's not he. And so Marath kind of discussed this a little bit on the call. It's not clear what sort of how extensive that waiver process would be, if it would be for each student that would exceed. I don't think that doesn't make sense, but we've been surprised before. And so I would hope that is just for the district, but that waiver process has not been, there's been, other than the fact, there's been a promise that a waiver would allow the districts to exceed those 20 days. We don't know anything more than that. So I can't really say with any sort of certainty what that waiver process would look like and sort of how hard it would be to complete.
It just seemed like a possibly new revenue stream for districts to use. It complicated, not an easy revenue stream to use, because now if a child, you go out there and you look at the conditions that are noted, and if you're going to set up remote staff anyway, now there was some discussion too about it doesn't have to be a certified teacher, and please correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, it can just be even a substitute. So I just thought, well, hopefully districts are looking at the possibility of, we never tapped into this because we weren't ready to go as far as remote conferencing. The other thing, it surprised me right now when you said, but nothing should surprise me at this point, when you said on the next slide that senators or a senator would think that 10% is too high, because I'm thinking for a pandemic year that 10% is too low. I'm not talking about, once everybody's good, whenever, if that ever happens, when everybody's good to go and face to face. But in a pandemic year, it seems like it should be, again, a local type of decision. It's local remote learning program, but locally you're not making some of the decisions,
Right. Yeah.
I think because.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, do they really know the folks on the legislature? Do they know what the counts look like even last year? Because we got just a quick little, barely a snapshot of this was face-to-face instruction in the different regions, and nobody, I don't think any region was at 90% last year in terms of face-to-face. I don't recall a 90%.
In terms of the whole region, you're probably right. I know certainly some districts, particularly smaller rural areas in certain parts of the state, they were probably exceeded the 90%. I think the concern is more to do with the sort of student outcomes and you know, as what was repeated over and over again during the testimony was that remote education seems to work for some students, and some students really thrive in that environment. But it's a small group of students, and Commissioner Morath and others repeated that they don't know exactly how small that population is, but they didn't, you know, they acknowledge it exists. But they quickly follow that up with in-person instruction is going to be seems to be the best fit for most students. And so I think that sort of concern over, you know, certainly they pointed to the STAR results and sort of the decline in that this past year. And I think that's really motivating some of their concerns over where to set that threshold. And so they kind of, again, saw those performance measures decline in a year where many students were doing online education. So they're hesitant to set that bar too high for fear of you know, continuing that downward trajectory and STAR results, essentially.
Well, let's get rid of the word local. Let's just call it the state remote learning program. But Romalda has a question. Hold on, or a comment.
Yes. Josh, how many times can a student be placed in the remote conferencing instructional setting? Because right now, I mean, we've had, fortunately, students that have gotten COVID more than once. And another thing that is going on right now, it's the RSV on children, of course. But there could be other communicable diseases, as the commissioner shared on the list. So we just want to make sure that districts will have the flexibility to place a child in remote conferencing more than once, depending on the medical condition. It's not, we hope that we don't have to place some, but the possibility of that may come up.
Yeah, and so just real quick, I pulled this up while Connie was talking, since you mentioned the list of communicable diseases. I'm gonna, it is listed here, and as Connie mentioned, the common cold on there, they've added COVID. It may not be on this list, but you can see that there's quite a long list of them. I'm gonna quickly, before I forget, I'm gonna send that in the chat. And so you guys can have that list of all the communicable diseases that sort of would qualify under this. So COVID, I think is this. I think it's it will be added to this list if it's not on already. But to your question, Romalda, in terms of how many times, I don't think there's the limit is not on the number of times they receive, or you know, the number of periods they receive remote conferencing. The limit is just on the number of days, right? So they could have 4 different periods over the year, right, of 5 days, and then you would not need a waiver in that case, right? And so, you know, you can chop up those 20 days and however many distinct periods you want. I think you'll still be okay. And so again, and once you exceed those 20 days, that's when, according to the guidance, a waiver will be required. And that's, as we sit here today, I don't know exactly if that's at a district level, that would be the sensible thing to do, or if it's, you know, something sort of more difficult to complete, if it's at the student level or campus level, or, you know, whatever. And so, and also the one other thing I'll mention that's not on the slide, for this remote conferencing thing, you know, as districts are kind of considering how to take advantage of this, you cannot have a teacher, you can't require a teacher to conduct the remote conferencing and teach in person at the same time, right? So you would have essentially a standalone remote conferencing program that would just serve the kids that were out during that period. And so you would, need a sort of flexible program that could respond to what, you know, the kids are going to probably vary over the course of the school year, right? In terms of what grade level they're in and sort of who's participating in this remote conferencing program. So you would need a sort of program that is flexible and able to transition as that student population changes. Were there any other questions on that? Oh. All right.
Josh, we're trying to keep up here quickly. Amanda did send out, Amanda Brownson, at 8:19 this morning, and it sounds like it's looking more possibly like a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
So we may, so just to let everybody know, because it's, you know, it's really recent, just go and look at, let's see here, if the documented temporary medical condition persists longer than 20 instructional days over the entirety of the school year, a waiver request must be submitted for an extension of remote conferencing beyond the allowable cumulative 20 instructional day period. The waiver request must include an explanation of the circumstances. Waivers will be granted on a case-by-case basis. A waiver will not be granted if the student is unable to attend school for a reason other than a medical condition such as confinement at home for disciplinary reasons. Okay,
yeah. So yeah, I think we understood that the waiver process was gonna, right. So that could be a case by case at a district level, right? I think that's kind of what we're hoping for, is that the district would just be able to apply for one waiver and that would cover all their students. And so that specific point is something we're still waiting on clarity from the agency.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to remind folks, just get a chance to take a look at that email too. Yeah, it'll be, we already, and we hope none of this, kind of just trying to prep for it, but we can see some children being out 10 days and 10 days in the fall. And then in the spring, if this thing really doesn't die down, having requests for more. But thank you for that, for those.
Yeah, and I'll show y'all real quick. I should have done this before, but the way to find that remote guidance, remote conferencing guidance is here on the COVID web page on TEA site. It's under academics, and then down here, virtual school network, and then excuse me, remote conferencing FAQ, and that's going to have, here's the to be proposed language in the SAW. And this kind of spells out the requirements I just went over. Yeah. All right. Okay, so switching gears here a little bit to tax rate adoption. This has been, I think that probably 90% of the emails I've gotten from folks in Region 1 have been related to tax rate adoption, the local property value survey, you know, how do I comply with truth and taxation requirements, all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to make sure y'all were aware that TEA has published a list of preliminary maximum compressed rates. They published that August 4th, and you can go and on the version, I think that's posted on the Region 1 website, the PDF version of this presentation. This link is clickable and you can go in and pull up and see what your preliminary MCR is. There were a lot of bugs with the local property value survey this year. For some districts, the application didn't pull in the right rate from last year, and for folks that had a local optional homestead exemption, it didn't calculate correctly. And so just go and make, I think Amy Ma at TEA has done a really incredible job with communicating with districts during this time, you know, especially due to the application not working all that well. And so it seems like everyone that we've worked with that has had an issue, she's been in contact with, and she's been super responsive at any time I reach out to her. And so if you do see a discrepancy on this list, you know, between this list and what you saw initially on your local property value survey, in teal, reach out to her, and the best email is on those TAAs that come out about the tax compression. I think it's tax programs at all one word, tax programs at tea.texas.gov, I think is the best email for her. And so again, this preliminary list has been published. Districts had until the 11th, I think, to appeal it. I know I think I worked with one or two of the districts in Region 1 that were appealing. And so I think they've gotten those submitted. Hopefully, if there's anyone else out there that was trying to appeal, you guys were able to get that request submitted to the agency. And then you'll get your final MCR. I guess I have it on the next slide here. I can move on here. You'll get your final MCR will be issued no later than August 31st. And then you'll see those MCRs reflected on the summary of finance by February. That's the deadline TEA put in that last TAA about tax compression. And so that's kind of the timeline on that. Just to kind of recap, make sure we're all kind of familiar in case there's any new CFOs on the call. MCR is the maximum compressed rate for just the tier 1 portion of your tax rate. So prior to House Bill 3, for most districts, that was $1. And so House Bill 3 put in this tax compression provision in place. And it's sort of slowly over the years going to compress that dollar down. And so last year the highest MCR was 91.64. This year the highest MCR is going to be 91.34. And then your tier 2 pennies, these pennies up here, those just float down on top of your tier 1 rate as your tier 1 rate is compressed. And so that's a really key thing to remember, because we've worked with some districts that accidentally adopted either a non-compliant tax rate or they gave up some of their tier 2 pennies, right? They had a TRE years ago. They miscalculated the rate. Let's say they had 17 pennies before House Bill 3. They adopted a rate that only had 5 tier 2 pennies. So they essentially gave up those tier 2 pennies. And once you give them up, that then becomes the standard on which your voter approval tax rate is calculated for the next year. So you have to go back to the voters to authorize those. So just the way we got to think about this is the MCR you get from TEA, right? So first step, you fill out your local property value survey after you get your July certified values. Then you get your results from TEA, your MCR from TEA. Then you just add to your MCR, you add the tier 2 pennies you had last year. And that's sort of the basic steps. There's some more nuances we'll get into here in a little bit, but that's sort of the basic step to calculate your M&O tax rate. And the second bullet point here, I just want to reiterate, this MCR is also used to determine your local fund assignment for tier 1. And so because of that, remember, as that MCR is compressed, obviously you will levy less taxes because of the lower tax rate. But because it's tied to the local fund assignment, you're also on the hook for a smaller local share to fund your entitlement, right? The state is picking up the rest of the entitlement and you're required to pay less of your entitlement because of that compression as well. And so I know some CFOs have called or emailed me with some sticker shock once they see, whoa, my MCR is being compressed, way more than I thought it would. Does this mean my budget? I'm going to have to make budget cuts because of this. And with tier 1 compression, the answer is no. This whole tier 1 compression and MCR, it's not going to change your entitlement, right? For tier 1, your entitlement is the number of kids you have, right? The types of kids you have, those other programs that you participate in, right? Teacher incentive allotment, the ADSE, right? All those other things that determines your tier 1 entitlement. The MCR and this tax compression, that's just going to determine on where that state-local split is set at. And so just keep in mind that if there is compression, that's not a bad thing necessarily for your district budget. And in fact, it can sort of free up some taxing capacity for your district. So we've worked with a number of folks who, for example, they had some compression in their MCR, right? They had compression on the M&O rate. And so what they've decided to do is adopt an INS rate that's a little bit higher than maybe the minimum they need to service their debt. They're adopting an INS rate that's a little bit higher, and then they can pay off their debt faster, right? And maintain the same overall tax rate, right? Just a slightly higher INS, so that way they can defease their debt. And if you're going to do that, feel free to reach out, but there's some other steps you got to do, like adopt a defeasance resolution and definitely work with your financial advisor on that. But that could be, one action that the tax compression sort of affords you. And so just again, be aware that if you do see compression, that does not mean a subsequent budget cut has to come with that on the M&O side. And so just kind of walking through again how this works for folks. So for a district that was at $1.17 prior to House Bill 3 in 1819, you can see here they had tier 1 compression. Everyone was compressed down to 93. And then they were compressed down to 91.64 in the 2021 school year. You can see their tier 2 pennies just floated down right on top. It's the same in both years, right? So in the first year of House Bill 3, there was some tier 2 compression. So the 17 pennies went down to 13.83. In this sample district here, they didn't go for a TRE or do anything else in 2021. Or adopt any disaster pennies. And so their tier 2 rate is just exactly the same as it was the prior year. And so then shifting over to next school year, for this sample district, and this would be the highest MCR a district could possibly have. The highest MCR would be 91.34. Of course, if you have property value growth in your district, your rate here may be lower, right? Because you may be subject to the local compression provision in House Bill 3. But in this sample district, their MCR was 91.34, so that's their tier 1 rate. And then again, they didn't do disaster pennies, they didn't go for a TRE. And so those same tier 2 pennies from before just float down right on top, right? And get added to this compressed MCR. And so they get a new rate of 105.17 compared to the prior year of 105.47. And so that's kind of how this process works and how it'll work going forward. You just take, unless you're doing a TRE or disaster pennies, you take your previously approved tier 2 pennies and just carry those over to the next year. And that's kind of reiterated on this slide as well. And so there's this other kind of concept out there, the voter approval tax rate, used to be the rollback rate. This rate determines what rate your district can adopt without having an election or adopting disaster pennies. And so unless you're having a TRE or doing disaster pennies, your rate, your proposed rate is going to be identical to your voter approval tax rate. The only situation where that won't be the case is if you haven't adopted 5 golden pennies already. But I think for most Region 1 districts, you guys are already above the 5th golden penny. And so for most of you guys, your proposed rate is going to be the same as your voter approval tax rate. But just to clarify how your voter approval tax rate is defined, again, the calculation is similar to your proposed rate. It's going to be your MCR plus the greater of 5 pennies or your prior year's tier 2 pennies. Okay, so essentially, if you haven't adopted the 5th golden penny already, you can go up to the 5. You can get the first 5 pennies of your tier 2 rate without going to the voters. That's just a simple board majority can approve a tax rate that only has 5 tier 2 pennies. If you have already had a TRE and you're already above that, then it's the way this formula will work for you is it'll be your MCR plus the prior year's tier 2 pennies. And then my little note here is you have to exclude the prior disaster pennies, right? So disaster pennies are temporary pennies, and they only last 1 year. So when you're in the following year, when you're going to calculate your voter approval tax rate, you have to drop those pennies off. So your voter approval tax rate cannot include those pennies from the prior year, the disaster pennies. And so this is kind of the tricky part. I mean, the MCR is pretty straightforward. You get that from TEA. This is the part where districts have some questions. And in most cases for Region 1 districts, it's just going to be the prior year tier 2 pennies, and then just make sure you take off any disaster pennies you adopt in the prior year. And then plus your INS rate. And so that's going to, all of those put together, that's going to be your voter approval tax rate. All right, I know that was a lot. I'm going to pause for any questions on that. So, and I don't like just sitting here lecturing y'all. So please ask me questions. That'll make this more fun for me at least. So I'll give y'all a couple seconds here to leave a question in the chat if you guys do have, if you're curious about anything.
Josh, have any of our districts asked you to help with just numbers, not exact districts, with the disaster tax rate? Because I've had a few districts just inquire about it.
Yes, and so I think we're working with, let's say at least 5 districts, I think, that are at least considering it. I'm not sure today how many are actually going to adopt disaster pennies. But so for Region 1, and again, with the way disaster pennies work is it has to be tied to a disaster that occurred in the previous calendar year, right? So we are obviously here in 2021 adopting our rate. So it has to be a disaster that occurred in 2020. And so for Region 1, I think the main one there would be Hurricane Hannah. And so there are a number of districts. I think I've spoken to at least 5 that are considering it. Again, I'm not sure how many will actually adopt disaster pennies tied to Hannah. And then next year, you can adopt disaster pennies tied to Winter Storm Uri, because I believe that was a majority of the state, if not all of the state was declared a disaster because of that. And so that will sort of open up that disaster penny provision for those districts as well. All right. Next thing I'm going to touch on is, I guess, some other buckets of money and some other initiatives from TEA. The main one that's kind of has a deadline that's coming up quickly is the Texas COVID Learning Acceleration Supports, or TCLASS. And it's the way I kind of think about this is just a sort of conglomeration of, I think, 15 different grant programs and supports that you can get from the agency. And so I think that is helpful to kind of streamline things a little bit. And so you can go into to the application. You have to submit the application, the initial application by August 20th. And you can kind of go in and pick which one of these initiatives your district wants to participate in. It includes high quality instruction materials, tutoring, residency programs, support for changing your schedule if you want to take advantage of the ADSE, the additional day school year incentive that was part of House Bill 3. And so there's just the PTech is part of that. If you guys want to stand up at PTech High School, you can get some funding for that. And so it's really just kind of it's a choose your own adventure kind of grant program at TEA has put together. Again, I mentioned the application closes August 20th. The initial award notification occurs September 10th, and they've set a tentative NOGA date at December 1st. And so again, I know there's quite a bit of money sort of out there through the stimulus programs, but if you guys are interested in this and sort of securing some additional funding to help support some of these initiatives in your district, that is available. The other thing to mention is a lot of this funding is sort of coming from the state share of ESSER, right? And so a lot of the timelines in terms of when you guys spend it by and the pre-award requirements and all that, that's sort of mirrors the ESSER requirement. And so just be aware of that. I think the only initiative in here that's not supported by ESSER is the PTech. I think if you're trying to get support for your PTech program at your high schools, that is going to be GR funded or funded from state funds. And so I think just about every other initiative that you participate in through this program will be funded through ESSER. And so that's sort of that last bullet point there alludes to that. Just make sure you have a pre-award period that begins March 1 to sort of align with those funding requirements. Okay. And so related to that, TEA has launched the Vetted Texas Tutor Corps. And that includes, through this program, you can get subsidized tutors, or it includes a list of TEA approved providers. And so the subsidized providers, that's just what TEA is offering through T-class. So I think it's like option 6 or decision point 6 in T-class. That is the TEA subsidized providers provided through this Vetted Texas Tutor Corps. They're synonymous. And so through that, I think as I list here, it's up to $500,000 per district. I think it's up to $2,000 per tutor. And then I forget there's a per student cap as well. And I don't have that in front of me right now. But you can use if you're going to be going through the T-class process to get tutors, you can use that money, again, up to $500,000 for the district to pay the tutors, to train the tutors. And so it's can be kind of flexible on how you deploy that to support your tutoring program. Also, if you participate in this, you also get access to the high quality instruction materials, and you get your tutors trained, and I guess maybe Connie can speak more to the region supported technical assistance that will be provided through this program. And then if that's some of those hoops maybe too much to jump through, and you're not quite ready to do the subsidized program, you can still participate in this, but just choose your own provider. I think the UT RGV is a provider, an approved provider. So I don't know if they've been in conversation, they've had conversations with the service center there on how exactly that partnership is going to work. But I think they are an approved provider. And so they would be, I'm not sure if they're partial or full service here. I think that would be, hopefully there's someone at the service center that could answer that question. But Connie, do you know who's spearheading that?
Well, actually, Josh, we're setting up a tutor hub program
Okay.
within Region 1 that's somewhat tied into our sub-hub program. And we have
Okay.
a lot of the instructional folks working on that too. So yeah, it's definitely getting put together. I don't know how many districts have already, I'm sure Brenda has already brought it up a couple of times, at least during HRAC, during their meeting. So, but yes,
Okay.
more information to come.
Yeah. So yeah, just know that with this, with these, if it's just TEA approved, there's no grant funding that comes with that, right? If you want to access the grant program, then you gotta go to T-class and sort of use the TEA subsidized provider. So they do kind of split it up that way. I realize I've been neglecting the chat, and so there was one question about from Jesse. It says, disaster pennies are due to Hannah. Any pennies for freeze? Okay, yeah, I think I answered that, Jesse. Yeah, so for next year, you could essentially re-adopt your Hannah pennies that you're adopting this summer. This summer. You could, remember, they're going to expire when it comes time to adopt your tax rate next year. So you could potentially re-adopt those Hannah pennies next summer and then tie that to the freeze. That could be an option. So you essentially, the way to think about it is anytime there's a disaster in the prior calendar year, that opens up that provision in the tax code, right? And so Hannah opened that up for y'all this summer. The freeze opened that up for y'all next summer. Okay. And then another question, if district approves the disaster pennies, what documentation is required after the adoption? Okay, so that's a good question. There's not really any documentation that's required to TEA. The way this works is if you adopt a disaster penny, TEA, so whenever after you report your rate to them, they're going to notice, hey, this is above your voter approval tax rate. Did you have an election? What happened? And then at that point, you'll just send them your resolution, your adoption resolution, and in that resolution, you will have stated the disaster for which you're adopting those pennies, right? So, you'll say something along the lines of, because of increased costs due to the districts, or that, associated with the district's response to Hurricane Hannah, for example, the district is adopting, 2 disaster pennies or whatever it is. And that's really it. You just have to send your resolution declaring that, acknowledging what the disaster is, and recognizing that you're adopting disaster pennies. And there's some law firms out there that can help y'all with that if you're with sort of drafting those resolutions. If you're interested in pursuing this, shoot me an email and I can pass along a firm we work with and some other recommendations. And so
Josh,
that,
if you could,
yeah.
Going back, actually asking on the disaster tax rate penny, because
Mhm.
there are other sources, insurance, of course, recovery, and TDEM. I remember when we did it with the 100-year hail in McAllen, the documentation back then was pretty much you just had to spend $1 on the disaster.
Right.
I mean, there was and I don't know if that's changed because again, they do have other sources for reimbursement, but I'm kind of hoping that hasn't changed, that as long as you can prove that you spent X number of dollars, even if it's $1.
Yeah, so the law says when a district has increased expenditures, right? So you had to have increased expenditures. And then, but you don't have to report your increased expenditures to anybody, right? You don't have to send those to EA. So in terms of like a statutory compliance situation and complying with the agency's requirements, all that, really the only thing that's going to be like absolutely required is the resolution that states the disaster. Now, the other part of this is more of a local political kind of situation, right? Because, you know, if it's the case that you guys are adopting a ton of disaster pennies, but you didn't have that, you know, you didn't have that many, a whole bunch of expenditures tied to the disaster, then that sort of mismatch may raise some questions locally, you know, from your school board to the administration or from taxpayers to the school board. And so, you know, again, it doesn't have to be perfectly aligned and by that, I mean, the revenue generated from the disaster pennies and your expenditures from the disaster, they don't have to be perfectly aligned. But I think from a sort of local political perspective, aligning those, I think is going to be a smart move, right? You don't want to, because essentially you got to remember the spirit of this law, right? It's helping districts really circumvent the local voter control to quickly respond to a disaster. And so to the extent you step out of line with that sort of intent, that can, I think, get you in trouble. Not so much from the state's perspective, but I think, you know, locally and sort of between, you know, again, your board and the administration or taxpayers and the board. And so that's, you know, I think that's about all the requirements related to in terms of providing documentation and all that to the state. There's not a whole lot there, but there could be more that your school board wants to see on that. So just be mindful of that.
Now, is it still that they can move pennies though from INS, and so the effect to the taxpayer is nothing? But as long as you're doing it first year of the biennium, so that for the districts that still get EDA, you're not impacted by that. I mean, you got to time it right. But is that what some are thinking of doing? You know, the net effect to the taxpayers is nothing, is nil.
Yeah, right. So yeah, there are some districts that are, you know, particularly because House Bill 1525 impacts rates that are adopted after September 1. And again, 1525 prevented districts from levying a rate with the intention of creating a surplus in M&O and then transferring that over to INS. So some districts are, they are adopting disaster pennies now, but what they're doing is they're making a transfer from the prior year or doing something like that. And so that's kind of how they're stepping around that requirement for this year. It does get a little bit harder in future years to do that, particularly because that provision in House Bill 1525 kicks in. And still, we don't know exactly how TEA is going to be monitoring this and sort of how, I think I mentioned this at the board conference earlier, or back in the summer. So, you know, we don't know how savvy they're going to be in catching districts that are trying to do this kind of thing. And so once we kind of get those compliance details and those sort of how they're going to check this, then we'll be able to know kind of what sort of actions are outside the bounds. But if you can get your rate adopted for September 1, you're able to essentially be grandfathered in. I'll note that that only applies to districts that are essentially keeping their M&O rate steady, right? They're keeping their tier 2 penny steady. House Bill 3 still included the provision that says you can't increase your rate in order to create a surplus on the M&O side and transfer it over to INS, right? So House Bill 3 said you can't increase it. House Bill 1525 said you just can't adopt a rate that does that, right? So it's a little bit more restrictive with 1525. But just remember that if you're trying to do this transfer stuff and you're increasing your rate, your M&O rate, that's still prohibited under House Bill 3. And so that's, I think at least one district is trying to do some fancy footwork there and do a transfer from the prior year to kind of get around that. But just know that is going to be more challenging in the years to come once 1525 kicks in and TEA starts sort of running some compliance on that.
You need to start adding a case study section to your presentation,
Yeah.
not identifying districts, but these are some of the, because sometimes, we just don't know what districts are out there doing or how they work with different attorneys and of course with Mo Casey, but different folks. But again, because it sounds like, well, this is allowable, but this may be questionable, but then that brings you back to allowable because it's
Right.
faster tax rate. You have a lot of flexibility there. So case studies,
Yeah.
real life. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, no problem. The next thing I saw, Connie, you put on the website, so I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but there is a TAA sort of cautioning districts about if you recoded any funds and federal funds that were received in 1920 school year, if you've since recoded them out of 199, if there's any charters on here, 420. And again, that would be if you've recoded it after you've submitted your 1920 final expenditure data in PEMS. So if that's the case, you need to quickly get in touch with the compliance group there at TEA, and you need to do so by September 3rd. And so I think I have this TAA link here. I think Connie also has it on the FAC agenda website there. So that's needs to go on your to-do list if this applies to you. And then of course the consequences of not doing this, it could throw off your MOE calculations going forward. So make sure to get that taken care of if that applies to you. Some other odds and ends here. I know we're a little bit over our time, so I'm going to try and move quickly. There's some new webinars coming to support districts who are in cohort E with the teacher incentive allotment. And the other thing I just want to stress, I think Region 1, you guys have been fairly early adopters of TIA, at least compared to other regions. I know the Service Center is doing a lot to support that. But the other thing I just want to remind folks of is the TIA program can help you meet your HB 4545 requirements, right? So you can, if a student fails the STAR in the prior year, you either have to give them 30 hours of tutoring for each test, right? Or put them in a class with a TIA certified teacher in the front. And so that can save you a whole bunch of tutoring hour requirements, right? You get a whole, you probably don't want to put a whole class of kids that failed STAR. That would be, I think, a lot for a teacher. But however, however your district wants to structure it. But if you do put some of those students that failed to STAR in the prior year in a class with a certified teacher, now you don't have to provide. You can avoid some of those tutoring costs for that student. And so I think that's and the TIA also it helps you draw down funding, right, for your district, and you can pay you can increase your teacher salaries and pay for the. I think you're also able to keep some money for the administration of the program there. And so again, I just want to remind you all that these things can kind of fit if you. There's a lot of requirements certainly on districts these days and more coming every day, it seems, but there are ways to kind of align these things and structure them in a way where they start to work together. And, if you're participating in one program, that can kind of save you some time and some money when it comes to complying with another set of requirements. And so I think this TIA and House Bill 4545 thing is a real opportunity to at least avoid some headaches with your district. The other thing that TA put out is a list of the CTE courses with the corresponding funding weight established by House Bill 1525. So of course that bill set up the CTE, FTEs, and tiers, right? I know you guys have heard me ramble on that for a while. And so now TA has put out a list of all the CTE courses and the weight, right? So not approved programs have 1.1 weight, the levels 1 and 2 courses have the 1.28 weight, and then the levels 3 and 4 courses have the 1.47 weight. And so all with each course, it's all listed there. And so that should help you sort of, I know with a number of y'all, I've sort of helped y'all kind of do this already, but if you're struggling with how to forecast and you're like what to plug in for your template next year for CTE, this list can help you do that. You hand it over to your CTE director and they should be able to help you calculate your FTEs by course level by using this list here. Let's see. We got some questions from y'all about the TAA that went out regarding the new J4 schedule. And it's going to be a required schedule that has to be in your AFR beginning with fiscal year end 2022. And they're related to spending on the comp ed programs and the bilingual ed programs. The TAA lists the specific PIC codes and it excludes PIC 99. I know one question that we got from a district was how is that going to be considered? Is it excluded? PIC 99 is excluded from the list in that TAA. I've emailed David Marks at the agency, and once I get a clear answer from him on that, I'll be sure to pass that along. And then there was another question about, I think in the TAA, it mentioned something around how 3 years can be used in this determination. And my reading of that is it's similar to sort of how the spending requirement compliance has been calculated in the past. They take a sort of a 3-year average. And so that's my reading of it, but sort of how that 3 years of data can play into determining compliance with the spending requirements. But I've asked for clarification from the agency as well. So once I get that, I will be sure to send that along. And then I think my last slide here is on retiree surcharges. We got a couple questions from a couple districts on SB 202. And so what that bill does, it prohibits districts from passing on the surcharge to retirees through payroll deductions or opposing a fee or other means. And so essentially districts are kind of left with two options as far as I can tell. I think this mirrors some of the guidance coming out of TASB's HR group. But so since the contracts for this school year have likely already been issued, you know, the first option is just kind of, you know, pay the surcharge for this next school year and then make changes for the next school year in terms of how you hire retirees. Or you can reach an agreement to sort of accept a resignation of the current 21-22 contract and then employ them under the 1 half-time exception. And if you do that, that eliminates the surcharge requirement. Then of course they have to be limited to half-time, but that's one way to avoid paying the surcharge. And that's all I got for y'all today. And so I'll happy to stick around for a couple minutes if you like to answer any lingering questions. But if not, thanks again for having me.